Okay, so hello, hi, and welcome. I wanted to talk to you guys about some of the new theories surrounding the origins of Nilotic migrations and Cushitic migrations. As you might notice, a lot in these spaces where we talk about these things, more northerly origins for both Cushitic speakers and Nilotic speakers have been something that's been a trend lately. Not even just in our spaces, but even in the academic world. And I'll just kind of be taking you guys uh, through that. I'm just going to be showing you guys about that. So, if you're in if you're in African Archives, my school community, African Archives University, you may have noticed I made a post recently today, highlighting basically the different locations and people groups of East Africa, specifically during the third millennium. So the time period we're looking at is around 3000 to 2000 BC. And I think this is a much more accurate approach in comparison with other maps, especially. I especially made this for the Proto-Nilotic speakers because we're not really given that much justice. I think it's very known that we had like a more northern origin, and I guess what I'm gonna try to do and explain to you guys is how exactly do we know that? Is it true, right? Um, and yeah, and even for the Cushitic speakers as well, the more northern origins being pushed for them, specifically in this little southeastern corner, northeastern corner of Egypt and Sudan, right there. And yeah, here we can kind of see like the different locations we have so far of the different people groups. So obviously the people I came here to talk to you guys about today, the Proto-Nilotics, the Proto-Nilotes, and even Semitic speakers as well have been theorized to have been here. And once I explain the theory to you, it all makes sense. Then we got like Northeastern Sudanic. I put Meroitic here as well because Meroitic, if the proposal that it's a Nilo-Saharan language is true, that would mean the ancestors of the early Meroitic speakers would have been living just a little bit to the west of the Proto-Nilotes at this time, before their expansion towards where you see Nile Cushitic, where they basically help establish the Kerma kingdom and eventually become the lingua franca of the Nubians, or not the Nubians, but the Kushites. Um, the scholar who actually proposes this language grouping and origin for the Meroitic speakers actually refers to them as the Kushites. The Kushites with a K, not Kush with a She, which is a big conflation a lot of people may tend to have. Besides that, we have Egyptians here, obviously, so this would have been like Old Kingdom and Middle Kingdom Egypt, and then you have Nile Cushitic as well. So this is really more like closer to like 3000 BC, I would say. But yeah, actually no, yeah, maybe even 2000 BC, around 2000 BC. There's you'll actually see in comparison around 2000. Yeah, 2000 BC you have Kerma. So this would be actually closer to like pre-Kerma. So like 3000 BC would be like a more accurate. So like if any part of the third millennium that this would be closest resembling, it would be the early parts of the third millennium, so in between 2500 and 3000 BC. So yeah, we have the Nile Cushitics here, Nile Kushites, Nile Cushitic people here, Kush with a C. You don't have the Kushites yet, until Kerma is literally the first city-state that people really associate with the Kush empires. It's not really. Sometimes it's treated as its own thing, but you get the real Kush kingdom with Napata, which is basically when the 25th dynasty happens, and that's what the Nubians are really famous for. And then Meroe, very famous for when they were doing the pyramid building as well. But yeah, besides that though, you can kind of see the different groups who would have been involved in Nubia. So mainly just Nilo-Saharan speakers and Cushitic speaking people. That's why I always tell people, if you want a black Egypt, you have to have these groups up north, but there's obviously like limited, like there's no other black people there. You have lowland Eastern Cushitic right here, so this would have been where the area near Punt, this was really, I think this is associated with a Gash group. I got this highlighted area from Kermatrix, because he's the guy who does a lot of the you know, investigations for Cushitic speakers. He's really in deep into the research for that. So what I did is really combine some of his work, some of that work in the forums and spaces where Cushitic history talks about much more, and I just decided to kind of merge it with what I know about Nilotic speaking people. And then obviously here we got the Southern Cushitic people, so this would be your SPN. So if you really want to get the breakdown of all the cultures, so and Northeastern Sudanic, that's your lighter band culture. There's a specific culture in the Wadi Hawar associated with the spread of like Nilo-Saharan speakers, specifically of Eastern Sudanic. Yeah, Proto-Nilotic and Semitic, and they were of the herringbone culture. So they were basically these lighter band people who ended up trading with these Nile Cushitic people and kind of adopted a lot of their, you know, patterns and whatever, specifically pre-Karma and A group. And then you have your Gash culture. They also traded with, you know, obviously the Nile Cushitic groups as well, but especially the Egyptians, which is what they're most known for. This is why this is the place where a lot of people speculate Punt's to be, and the culture that they associated with. So you mean lowland Eastern Cushitic, so a lot of your Cushitics in the Horn, including Somalis, would eventually migrate down south here. These are possibly, you know, you're looking at their ancestors right there. And then you have South Cushitic, so basically just a Cushitic group that just migrated very far south very soon. But yeah, besides that though, that's kind of what you're looking at. And then obviously Egypt, again, like I explained earlier, that's, you know, ancient Egypt, ancient Egyptians right there. So looking here, we have a kind of spread in the general trend of like migration with Nilotic speakers from the Wadi Hawar. And I think the thing that I have to kind of admit, or not even admit, the thing that I have to explain to you guys is basically the general trend of how Nilotic migrations, or not even just migrations, how you would find the Nilotic homeland. And pretty much the way that I kind of explain it, this was my biggest one of my big realizations, was that number one, the three big language groups, Niger, Congo, Nilo-Saharan, and Cushitic, right? Afro-Asiatic speakers. These are the big three language groups that kind of expanded into sub-Saharan Africa. All those three groups of people and language groups originated in the Green Sahara / Sahelian regions. And the reason why, and basically what they did was, while they were in the Green Sahara, they learned how to food produce. So specifically for the Bantu, those were the Niger Congos who had their big expansion into the rest of sub-Saharan Africa. They basically learned food producing. For them, it was farming, and they spread across hunter-gatherer areas. Now you kind of have to understand this concept. Food producers and hunter-gatherers. Food producers usually, you know, number one, out-compete hunter-gatherers for just many different reasons. Usually the better, more superior they have, higher populations, etc. So it's a lot easier for them to just kind of overtake and assimilate these hunter-gatherer populations. And that's kind of what you see with the Bantu expansion. The Bantus were just a bunch of West Africans who expanded over hunter-gatherer Africa. And another thing you notice too is that before the Green Sahara, there was literally almost no food producing inside of sub-Saharan Africa. Almost none. Most of the groups down south were actually all hunter-gatherers, and most of the groups down south were like mostly hunter-gatherers. And I kind of have like a theory that if most people stayed in the Green Sahara, you would have seen a lot more civilization in Africa that you can connect with Black people, sub-Saharans, than you actually do see, because there would have been more contacts with the world, with, you know, Egypt and the Middle East and the Mediterranean as well. Not to take away that, you know, say like, oh, there was no civilization or accomplishments, but I'm just saying there would have been more of that. But yeah, I mean, besides that though, that's the same exact case that you have for Nilotic and Cushitic. Although, you know, whenever there's contact with other food producers, it's usually like a few kind of minority type of populations, but for the most part, what you have during the Neolithization of Africa, the transition of, the spreading of agriculture and pastoralism, you basically just have food producers speaking one of these three big major language family, Afro-Asiatic, Nilo-Saharan, or Niger-Congo, with three subgroups, specifically Nilotic, Bantu, Cushitic. These groups expanding over hunter-gatherer groups. Because if you look at South Cushitic, most of the groups that were in Kenya by that time, they were all hunter-gatherers, including South Sudan, especially Ethiopia. These groups just expanded, right? So going back to the Nilotes, if you want to find the origin of Nilotes, what you would be able to tell when you're reconstructing Nilotic and Proto-Nilotic and what you're trying to figure out, you have to understand the kind of lifestyle of these people, and sort of understand the way they expanded as well. So if you want to find Proto-Nilotic, basically the cheat code to it is that you need to understand that whoever was Proto-Nilotic, their ancestors, right, the Proto-Nilotic speakers, they were pastoralists. You can even say this, the Proto-Eastern Sudanic, which is the bigger, larger family that Nilotic is a part of, they were also pastoralists. So whoever the Proto-Nilotic speakers were, they were pastoralists. And then on top of that was the way that they expanded. Here's a piece of information. The reason why it's called Nilotic is because the way when Nilotic people were expanding, they were expanding along the White Nile. And so that's why we're called Nilotes. They were just you'd have to so basically what we kind of can understand from this is that Nilotes were basically just a northern Nilo-Saharan group living in Green Sahara that expanded southwards along the White Nile. And once you kind of understand that, fundamental concept, then it starts to make sense. And so basically, to illustrate this point more, let me do something. Now, I can't believe I forgot to say this, but it's good. The other final piece of information that you're going to need to be able to put together this Nilote story, right, is the fact that Proto-Nilotic is estimated to have been spoken sometime around the 3rd millennium, so around 3000 BC. You put that information together, you're only left with a few areas, and basically it's where you have evidence for basically black Nilo-Saharan people, which we do have, around 3000 BC, somewhere in the north, practicing cattle pastoralism, somewhere relatively close to the White Nile. And so when you do that, you're left with only a few places, especially here, near Khartoum, and then there's also the White Nile, which is actually the popular theory. So the theory that there is now is that basically, out of all these pastoralist groups, the only other options that really contend, you could say like here, somewhere along the White Nile, Jazeera region, but it's too early for it to be Nilotic pastoralism, right? Not that it couldn't be, but it's a bit too early. What actually is way more compatible is here, just a little bit north of the Six Cataracts here. I don't know what the site is here. And then, here, near Neolithic Khartoum. And then here there's, this place north of Khartoum, 2500 to 2400. And then here in Wadi Hawar, the lower Wadi Hawar, where it's the same reason. Now, the reason why I'm a little bit in favor of lower Wadi Hawar is because there was a migration from the Wadi Hawar to the Nubian Nile Valley, which is almost undoubtable. It's the migration that's suspected to have been the ancestors of the Meroitic speakers. And we know that they were Eastern Sudanic, or at the very least, there was a very heavy Eastern Sudanic influence. Whatever group of Nilo-Saharans that migrated into Nubia, they were Eastern Sudanic, undoubtedly. So, what we kind of can understand is that, number one, these groups of people living on the Wadi Hawar are connected because they come with the same wave of migration, specifically related to lighter burn groups. So to put Proto-Nilotic around the lower Wadi Hawar around this time, it just works for so many different reasons. Number one, because we can kind of tell, we can strongly suggest that whoever was there were Eastern Sudanic speaking people, just because of that migration into Kerma near Dongola. But then also, remember what I said about Nilotic. They have to be people relatively close to the White Nile. There's also evidence for southward migrations after this period, suggested with the Hendesi phase. And then basically they just migrate southwards along the White Nile. They're food producers, they're cattle pastoralists, they're black Nilo-Saharans specifically. And they date around the time where you would have had Proto-Nilotic spoken. So here's a little bit of a kind of a graph or a table that I put together. I originally made this like a year ago, and I've updated it along the way with extra information that I learned, and I'll just kind of take you through it. So first you have around 3000 BC. I lined up the timelines with what was going on in Nubia because I mean, guys, like, come on, this is just too close. You know what I mean, to Nubia geographically. It's basically the same land. But yeah, so around 3000 BC, in Lower Nubia you have A group, Upper Nubia you have pre-Kerma, and the location of Nilotic speakers would have been around the Lower Wadi Hawar and Wadi al-Malik area. So that's basically just the highlighted area you see here. These are all the same color, so it might be hard to tell, but you can kind of just see. It's like in this general, type of area. And then 2500 BC, you have Kerma culture happening, and you still have, the ancestors of Nilotes living in the same place. But during 1500 BC, Lower and Upper Nubia, specific parts, not the whole of Upper Nubia, but I think it goes all the way up to like the four cataracts, if I'm not mistaken. They're under Egyptian occupation and colonization. So this is when they got Egyptianized. This is when Egyptian influence in their culture would have really skyrocketed. And during this time, you have the Hendesi phase migrations out of the lower Wadi Hawar. And it looks like where they're going to is towards Central Sudan, specifically crossing parts through northern Kordofan, and heading towards places like the Jazeera and places near Khartoum. And here you can, we easily see one of these maps kind of like illustrating what these migrations would have looked like, right? So you have the Proto-Nilotes and Semitic speakers living here, just to the west, the immediate west of the Nubian Nile Valley, and then between 1000 BC, so during the second millennium, they start migrating towards central Sudan. Basically, and around 1000 BC, I kind of hypothesize Nilotes to be in around the central Sudanese and Jazeera region. It would only make sense for them to be there, honestly. And around 500 BC, southern and eastern Nilotics likely start expanding southwards alongside the White Nile, going towards places like South Sudan, but you don't have evidence for them until the AD years, which is actually pretty interesting. Might talk about that a little bit later. And then around 0 AD you have Nilotes still in Central Sudan. And then, as I said, beginning of Jebel Moya pastoralist occupation. So basically here around 0 AD, I kind of hypothesize, I've seen there's a site in the Jazeera called Jebel Moya. And basically there's been some connections that have been made with Nilotes. It's not 100% certain that they were Nilotes, but it's been suggested. They practice certain things like agropastoralism, other things that they practice dental evolutions. So you know what I mean? That was a thing. The only thing that I've kind of heard that could like associate them with Nilotes is And one thing I have to say too is, well, Jabal Moy has many different occupation periods. So the one I'm specifically tying them with is the Meroitic period occupation. Basically, the people there at the time, they not only did they practice all these Nilotic cultural traits, which I kind of detail inside of this article. This article, The Concise History of the Dinkas. I think I talk about it here in the Jazeera section. Um, yeah, I talk about it here in the Jazeera section. So somewhere around here, you'll be able to kind of see what I'm talking about in the different connections I've made. And in the PDF document, what was it called? The PDF document, a journal on Nilotic prehistory. You'll see more about where I talk about that in more detail. But those people basically traded with the Meroitic people. These people were probably like very, very important, right? Whoever was living in the Jazeera, that is, i.e., Western Nilotes, were very, very important. I think there's a lot of history in the area that gets missed out on because, number one, they traded with the people, the kingdom of Meroe, then had pastoralist elites and etc. But then also there was in the periplus of the Erythraean Sea, it suggests that there was a place called Sinium where they used to trade ivory, which is very common trade amongst Nilotic speaking communities, pastoralist communities, trading ivory and things like that. A place called the Axumites used to get ivory from a place called Sinium. And Sinium was suggested to be near Sennar or just the general Jazeera region. And since Jebel Moya is a place where they had, trade with the Meroitic kingdom, it's very likely that these people also had something to do with what was going on with the Axumites and who they were trading with, who have been suggested to live in the same exact type of area. So there's those two things, right? Number three, though, which has to be another very important thing, is that they might have been people in the Jazeera living around this time, who I will continue to say were likely Nilotes. They were one of the people who led the Roman expedition. They were one of the people who led the Roman expedition to find the source of the Nile Valley, which they led the Romans to around somewhere around Malakal, and then they, I don't know if they led them, but they allowed them to come, because basically the situation, what's documented apparently is the king of Meroe had to ask the kingdoms or chiefdoms of the south, which presumably would be in the Jazeera region, to allow these people to pass. So these were very powerful people living there at the time when the Romans came. And basically kind of allowed Romans to pass through, or maybe even help them get towards areas further to the south, presumably around Malakal, where they met the Sud. And they couldn't go any further because, it was just too much water. It was a huge swamp, the Sud. Around AD 500, you have Nilotes arriving somewhere in Western Kenya. This is kind of inaccurate. This is when the expansion towards Western Kenya happens. It happens in between 500 AD to around 900 AD. And then you also have around the same time, just a few centuries later, actually. I think actually it might even be 1000 AD, so that might actually be a little bit wrong. But there was a expedition that the king of Lothian made, into, southerly areas of his kingdom, which at the time would have been more associated with the northern parts of the Jazeera. He migrated down south to the west, he migrated down south along the White Nile and found groups of people living with their cattle who kind of sound reminiscent to Nilotic speaking people. So that likely, if Senium was Nilotic, Senium would be the first mention of Nilotic speaking people. But this could be the second mention of Nilotic speaking people as well. And they would have been just people living to the south of Alodia. And then around 1000 AD, there's also another mention specifically of the Dinkas living to around areas likely around Baragazal, around 1200 AD. And they were called the Damadim, or the Tartars of Sudan, which was just the Tartars of the black people. Because at the time, basically, while the Persians were getting raided by the Mongols, they got raided by specifically the Tartar clan of the Mongols. And around the same time, there was a not southern Nilotes, there were western Nilotes around Barkazal living somewhere. It doesn't have to be Barkazal specifically. It's just been suggested. Some say along the White Nile, closer to South Sudan, and Sobat, just the general region south of what was Alodia. Some western Nilotes basically raided the, absolute F word out of the kingdom of Alodia, and they also raided the Habesha as well. And there's been evidences of basically damage that has been done along, even in Soba, the capital city of Alodia, near modern-day Khartoum, and throughout the kingdom of Alodia, and towards certain places near like Ethiopian highlands or whatever, that they raided on these, and they've been connected with the Damadim or Tartar of Sudan invasions. And there's even been a map connecting the Dinka with this, and it makes sense, honestly, that they were Dinkas, because the theory is that either they were Dinka or Luo people. But Dinka, they're the ones with the more northerly claims for an origin for this time, and as well as direct influence from the Alodian Nubian, language. So you have that, and then Luo expansion out of Barkazal is said to happen around this time, and you'll kind of see how this kind of matches well with archaeology. I was really just kind of guessing, looking at maps, but I read a full book on South Sudanese archaeology, like just a few days ago, and I've kind of studied it a lot. Oh yeah, and by the way, I've also kind of forgot to mention as well, these around these these are like what's going on here in Nubia during these times, right? So that Tartar of Sudan invasion would have happened during Christian Nubia, for those who don't know. And then and then around 1500 AD, you have the Dinka expansion. Again, matches up very well with archaeology done in South Sudan, and Islamic expansion. So the thing is, one thing you might notice is that you don't really have evidence for a Nilotic expansion in South Sudan until actually the AD years. You don't and that's one of the things that I've kind of realized looking at the archaeology of South Sudan. So one of the most interesting things about South Sudanese archaeology is that from around 3000 to around 1000 BC, we basically have traditions of basically just hunter-gatherer groups in South Sudan. And here they just call them lithic Stone Age communities. But the thing is, though, around 500 BC, we have our first introduction of pastoralists into South Sudan. But the thing that's actually most surprising is that the earliest cattle pastoralists weren't actually Nilotes. They were Central Sudanic speaking people, which is actually something that kind of really confused me. But it is what's been suggested. There were basically people who were hunting, fishing, alongside having cattle activities, as well as using iron. So they had a few like iron artifacts as well, and they lived somewhere around here. Let me see if I can find They live extremely far south in South Sudan, Jebel Tuki. And then there's another site here as well called Dangria. And they also had like another really early evidence for pastoralism as well, around 8500. But the weird thing with them is that although their physiology kind of seemed to be of like a Nilotic type, they didn't practice dental avulsion, so we weren't really able to fully establish whether they were Nilotes or not. Now, some of the most interesting findings about this is that there was a specific culture called the Turkwel tradition, of Western Kenya and Northern Uganda. And as you can see here, it's a Turkana tradition of Northeastern Uganda and Western Turkana has been dated to around AD 450 and 1100 and explicitly linked to the early Nilotic speakers. So this is actually very interesting because the early Eastern Nilotic speakers, because you have this here, but then some, I think, okay, here, they talk about how they found certain, let me see, you find evidence for the same tradition in southeastern Sudan, dated later, towards closer to the mid-second millennium AD, and also linked some of these migrations with these groups, specifically the eastern and southern Nilotes. And specifically they related to the, let me see if I can find it, the Lanit and Sirikwa traditions of the Western Highlands and Central Rift Valley in Kenya. Yeah, so okay, yeah, no. So these are much later. But yeah, so we can kind of see certain, sites and archaeology and practices, traditions that they're associating with different Nilotic speakers. But what I think we can infer from this, and I might have to update this in the future because I don't really know exactly how the spread of Eastern and Southern Nilotic worked. It almost seems like what we would assume first is that it's really the spread of Eastern Nilotic would have actually been a lot more eastwards than where like a lot of them live. Specifically towards the southeastern parts of South Sudan, that's probably where they would have been at, coming from the north, and then they would have spread it eastwards, and somewhere southwards, so like the Bari and Kakwa, they probably would have went a little bit eastwards. The Maasai likely went to the south, etc. And then here we have a map of specifically southern Nilotic expansions. These expansions happened sometime between 500 AD and 900 AD, and you can see they're coming from the extremely far south of southern Sudan, migrating through Uganda and then entering into Western Kenya. You can see the group with the Kalenjins and the Togs, and also I think there's also been links made with the Tutsi people as well. Some people even suggest, some of my friends in here, that the Tutsis may have been southern Nilotes like the Datoga people, who just assimilated a bunch of Cushitic people, which could be true. I'm not sure if we know for sure, but I think it's likely. The Datoga, just for your information, they are majority Cushitic genetically. Genetically, they have way more Cushitic DNA than even Nilotic ancestry, and even more Cushitic haplogroups. That's, not being a Nilo-Saharan for you. Matrilineal traditions, you get your haplogroups switched, replaced. But yeah, they have all this Cushitic DNA and ancestry, but we label them Nilotic because the ethnic group in origin is actually Nilotic. It's not Cushitic. That's why we call them Nilotic, and they speak a Nilotic language. Despite having certain Cushitic influence, obviously. So, and they were linked with the group W tradition as well. Just so you guys know. And it's really interesting that what we have here with the spread of Eastern and Southern Nilotes, because you kind of have to almost kind of guesstimate them with some of these like time periods migration. So here's something I looked up a little earlier, for the Lanit tradition in Kenya. But there was I forgot what I was gonna say. You kind of have to almost figure out how these migrations would work. I feel like we have a lot of empty spaces, especially for southern and eastern Nilotic in terms of archaeology in South Sudan. We do have certain sites like in Jonglei, where there are a lot more northerly that have been linked with these eastern Nilotes, so we can maybe link them with the spread. But what we can kind of see here is that basically around the AD years is when you really have the spread of Eastern Nilotic and Southern Nilotic into South Sudan, and maybe they could have gotten there a little bit earlier. Really, the evidence we see of them post dates around like 500 AD. But since they're in far southern Kenya, you could probably imagine that they would have entered South Sudan originally maybe around close to 0 AD, or even, a little bit earlier, maybe a little bit in the BC years, with them being obviously like a lot more northernly. But yeah, I mean, yeah, and the weirdest thing as well is that, I think some of our earliest evidence for Nilotic groups in Kenya, according to like ancient DNA, one of the only Nilotic samples is actually a 900 AD, not 900 AD, 900 BP sample, so it dates to the second millennium, around the 12th century, 1100s, for those who don't know. But yeah, we can kind of see. And then obviously, like around this time, you would have Western Nilotes closer to the Jazeera, in between the Jazeera and Sobat, with, mentions of them closer towards the second millennium, or the late first and second millennium. Basically just Nilotes living to the south of the kingdom of Alodia. And that's where actually you can actually we get this theory that the Funj kingdom, the Funj people, for those who don't know, they were basically like an Islamic sultanate in medieval Sudanese history, may have been Nilotes, because they have been theorized to, they've been said in multiple documents, multiple times, that they come from southern regions which were more associated with the Western Nilotic speakers. And then also there was like sultans who claimed that Dinkas and Shuluks were their brothers, and there's even a theory that they were a Shuluk as well. Regardless of the fact, though, we can kind of get a picture of what, a lot of these Nilotic expansions would have looked like, but also how compatible they are with a more northern origins, especially in terms of the archaeology, the spread of pastoralism, the genetics, and it's just I think I'm very happy and grateful that this stuff can be really like examined more. And then obviously to finish off, I think this makes a lot more sense now when you have this understanding, where you can kind of see these groups of ancient Nubians looking like Nilotes, and this is around 1000, around the New Kingdom. So around like 1000 BC, and you have first, these groups living here up until like around 2000 BC, and then you have this happening, and it's looking like this. I think this makes a lot more sense now, because you have a lot of Nilo-Saharan groups, although they may have not been and here are just some of the other things as well. Sinyum, they place it in South Sudan, but it's more likely up north here, where they have Ivory at, which is where you likely had Western Nilotes at this time, the first century, so 0 AD to 100 AD, which again, strong evidence for Nilotes here, Western Nilotes especially. So what was I going? But yeah, no, this makes a lot of sense, because we see like a lot of cultural relationships and similarities with the Nilo-Saharan peoples here. And then also these locations might be able to link, the ancestors of Nilotes with a group called Yam, or ancient lost city kingdom called Yam. I don't think they were like a city or something, but people who the Egyptians used to trade with. Basically just the general Nubian area, a lot of those like lost lands, ancestors of Nilotes could contest for them. But yeah, man, so I hope this has kind of helped your understanding. Obviously, as more information I come across and evidence for Nilotic migrations and patterns of movement can be made, I'll definitely update here. I think my understanding for Western Nilotic migrations is a little bit better understood. You have migrations of Western Nilotes into South Sudan. Pretty much evidence, pretty much like you have a firm presence after 1000 AD. and we can kind of see that here as well. The thing for Western Nilotic, actually, which I can't believe I was about to wrap up without saying this. The spread of Western Nilotes can really be shown with the can really be traced with the spread of Senga or humped cattle in the South Sudan, which you don't really get until a lot later period. So specifically with the site called Dangrel, there are two different phases of occupation there. There is a early Iron Age occupation, which is around 500, no, not 5, yeah, it's around like 500 to like 1000 AD. I don't know if they save it, post it here. You'll see, I'll be sure to link the paper in the description or wherever I post this. I don't know if this is gonna go on the archives, or I might post part of this on the full thing on the archive and part of it on YouTube. But yeah, it can really be traced with the Sanga cattle, the humped cattle. So there's two phases in a site called Dangrel, which is really extreme far in like northwest South Sudan, the super west, and you don't really have a Dinka migration in there towards until like the second half of the second millennium. But you can kind of see here, right? But yeah, so there's like one occupation where it's like from 580 to like around 1000, and then another occupation around 1000 towards like 1500s. And they basically label them the early Iron Age and the late Iron Age. And you can kind of see where they talk about it here. Some people having Nilotic build the earlier people, but they lack the you know what I mean, the signature of like you know what I mean, like Nilotic people, which is a dental evolution. But there was a subsequent, so subsequent means later introduction of humped cattle, which is explicitly linked with the spread of Western Nilotes, and in several sites in other areas of Sudan where there's historic pastoralists, Dinka. These are closer to other areas in South Sudan. We have other spreads of Dinka groups. There's actually a place here I kind of want to show that will help us with the timelines for Dinka specifically. So I'm gonna have to show you this map in comparison with the others ones, right? So this is the area they're looking at here is this place in between Yorul and Rumbek. These are basically just two cities in modern day South Sudan, and here are some of the other places. These places I think have been associated with speakers of Nilotic, specifically the Eastern Nilotes and the Tsarkwel tradition, so which would have been located here and here. This archaeological site hasn't been dated, but it's been connected with the the tradition of the Eastern Nilotes, which is the Tsarkwel, and then obviously like Southern Nilotes would expand here. So you basically got this kind of network sometime around like AD 500 and later. Some even going later in towards like the second millennium as well, being practiced today by the Taposa people as well. But obviously, like the migration would have been a north to south, generally. For here, this is Rumbek though, and you have to look at the migration routes of the Dinka, which I'll actually bring up now. So this is what the migration routes of the Dinka would have looked like, and here are the kind of dates, right? This is where Rumbek is kind of located in comparison right here. And you can kind of see this is the migrations. This is after the conquering of Soba, and you can kind of see the Dinka expansion by like time periods, which is a lot more recent. Although you can link the spread of Western Nilotes with the introduction of Sanga cattle, which really much occurred post 1000 AD. The Dinka migration was a little bit later, so this basic would have been Dinkas expanding over certain Luo lands. Me, in fact, honestly, in actuality, I'm Dinka born, so my people actually live here. My great grandfather, he's a Luo, my clan founder, so he's my great grandfather times 14. His ancestors lived around here. The Luo people expanded southwards, lived in eastern Equatoria, and then they came back. and then we assimilated into the Dinka tribe. So yeah, you know what I mean, in very recent years as well. I think around the same time where you have these Dinkas moving into Rumbek, so around the 1600s. So I'm not a real Dinka, guys. You know? No, I'm joking. But yeah. So it kind of shows you kind of the kind of like networking, what was kind of going on. But at the end of the day, still Western Nilote. But yeah, you can kind of see the timing, and all of this is post 1300s AD. So you can see they're migrating from the Jazeera. They didn't all have to be, you know what I mean, like in Soba. Some of them could have just been living generally throughout the Jazeera, in between here and here, and just migrating southwards after raiding Alodia, and obviously like some claiming the Ethiopian lands as well. Because in the historic records, they're also been recorded to raid the Habesha, although the meaning of Habesha was a little bit more different during that time. So this is kind of the evidence for the occupation here. So first, and this is like kind of similar. Let me see if I can find. Do we have these? Oh. Yeah, no, yeah. So we're actually pretty good. So yeah, these are like sites associated with some like Dinka occupations as well, and this is kind of just the general like timing of it. And these kind of like, you know, networks here between Rumbek and Euro. So first you have common pressed cattle. So these might have been your like some central Sudanic speaking people. Then they have undecorated bowls around like 0, year 0. And then here you have first ironworking, woven map impressions. And these are like descriptions of like the pottery styles. Around 1000 AD, still have woven map impressions on vertical scoring in the west, pole and dagger structures. So there's still no Western Nilotes in this region, as far as late as 1000 AD, and then between 1000 AD and 1500 all the way to the modern, so like close to like 1600s, you don't have any occupation. There's like a space of you know what I mean, time where nobody was really there. And then you have the modern occupation, which was the Dinka, which is kind of characterized by rouletted pottery, which is something in South Sudanese archaeology they link closely with Nilotic speakers. So not even just Dinkas or Western Nilotes, but even the Eastern and Southern Nilotes, as I showed you. And the Dinka cattle camps as well. And so that's where we kind of have that evidence for this, where it kind of shows the dates match up pretty, you know, smoothly. But yeah, besides that though, this is the expansions of Nilotes and basically how they would have worked. To summarize, basically they would have started off here, right? They would have started off with the, you know, where's the other map? The other map. They would have started off with the, yeah, you're right. Wadi Hor diaspora, so they would have been living west of Nile Kashitik. You know, and pretty much sandwiched in between like the people who would eventually speak Meroitic languages in the ancient Nubia, and then they migrate south towards, you know, central Sudan, presumably through Kordofan, specifically northern Kordofan, through areas like here, and towards the Jazeera, maybe parts of Khartoum as well, and basically would have chilled out through here until around like the AD years. You have migrations, you know, generally like a trend southwards along the Nile. Around the AD years, you have southern Nilotic reach here and western Nilotic reach here, and you have western Nilotes then network around here, around like 500 to like 1000 AD, and then you don't have the spread of western Nilotes until, you know, post 1000 AD towards here. So that's basically what the migrations would have looked like for the Nilotes so far, with our current understanding. So I hope you enjoyed this video. I hope it was very informative, especially if you're not a Nilotic person yourself. I hope this provided great value for you. And yeah, See you in the next one.